All right, so a brief caveat before I get started recording this. Typically, I will be recording lectures in my face-to-face class, and so you will hear, interaction from other students. When I recorded this particular PowerPoint in class last week, whenever I went to convert it to a video, PowerPoint crashed and lost all of my recordings. So I have to redo this one, so it's going to sound just a little bit different from the other videos that you will hear for the rest of the quarter. So the first topic we are going to be covering is the history of psychology. And I will admit right away that history was never one of my favorite subjects, and that may be true for a lot of you as well. I think just the way that I was taught it, I always found it a little bit boring, to be honest. Obviously, when it comes to the history of psychology, I find that quite a bit more interesting since I am interested in psychology myself. And so I think it's really important that we examine this topic so that we kind of have some context to know how we ended up where we are today in the field of psychology. So a couple of the main takeaways that I want to make sure that you get from this lecture. Number one, I want you to kind of think about the history of psychology as being kind of like this pendulum that has been sort of swinging back and forth between two extremes. And this tends to be true of a lot of things, not just psychology, but a lot of other fields, politics, all kinds of things like that. We tend to kind of swing from one extreme to the other. And there's kind of a couple of different pendulums that we can talk about in regards to psychology. The first is this difference between a focus on a philosophical understanding and a scientific understanding. So a philosophical understanding of psychology is kind of how it started. And basically philosophy essentially is, a bunch of people kind of sitting around talking about things, and they come up with all kinds of ideas and they talk through the logic of whether those ideas are sound or not. Science, on the other hand, uses actual observation to try to test those ideas. So there's a lot of similarities between philosophy and science. They both tend to come up with like theories and ideas, but in the scientific view, we want to then test those ideas with observations and studies. So throughout the history of psychology, there have been some who have really focused on just, sort of philosophical, talking about these philosophical concepts about how we think, how we behave, etc. And then there are other, fields or subfields that are much more focused on scientific process, on trying to test those different ideas and theories. Kind of hand in hand with that, there's also been this distinction between focusing on our inner worlds and thoughts and focusing on observable behaviors. So right now, I'm sitting here in my home office recording this. You can hear, the words that I'm saying, but none of you can access my actual inner thoughts or inner world. And same for me. So, right now out in the world, you're somewhere, maybe in your apartment, maybe you're in another class or whatever. Even if I could see you, even if I was, with you face to face and I could look you in the eye, I still would have no clue what your own inner thoughts are. You might be thinking about what you had for breakfast this morning. You might be thinking about something that you need to do for an assignment for another class later. You might be scrolling through social media and kind of focusing on that. Right? There's all these inner thoughts that you could be having that I could never access just by watching you. So some fields of psychology tend to focus on that, on those inner thoughts, and trying to figure out, what's sort of going on in people's minds. Other fields throughout history have focused more on observable behaviors. So even though, if I was with you face to face right now, I couldn't tell what's going on in your mind, there are lots of things that I would be able to observe. I could tell if you're making eye contact with me. I could, would be able to see if you're taking notes and if you're doing that on paper or if you're doing it on a laptop. I could see if you're talking to your classmates next to you. So all those things that you do that are visible, those are observable behaviors. And some fields of psychology throughout history have focused much more on those observable behaviors. In the past, there's been kind of this parallel between focus on inner thoughts being much more philosophical and focus on observable behavior being scientific, but that's not always necessarily a one-to-one case, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But main thing, as we talk about, sort of the history, just kind of think about this pendulum swinging back and forth from one extreme to the other. And then eventually we'll work our way up to talking about contemporary psychology, And one of the things you will see is that contemporary psychology is composed of many very diverse subfields. So a lot of people who don't have a background in psychology, you know, and I assume all of you, if you're coming in here taking an intro psych class, you probably don't know a ton about psychology, like a lot of people in the world. You know, you may think of psychology as kind of just this narrow thing, which would be like counseling and therapy, right? Most people, when they think of psychology, they think like, okay, that's a person who's going to sit down and, you know, give someone therapy. They're going to try to diagnose some sort of mental illness and treat that mental illness. And that's certainly a part of psychology, and it's an important part of the history of the field, but it's by no means the only thing that psychologists do. There's, you know, a huge range to these subfields that exist within psychology. So we'll talk very briefly about some of the main subfields in contemporary psychology. Okay, so to start, we're going to talk about early history. I do not expect you to memorize any particular dates, but I do want you to kind of orient yourself with the basic timeline we're talking about here. So 19th and mid 20th century, that would be basically from like the 1800s up to about 1950 is kind of, you know, the time period that we're talking about here. And obviously in that amount of time, you know, a huge number of things would have happened, and we're really just kind of skimming the surface of those. So this is a very, very brief and simplified history of psychology. So one of the first fields of psychology that we're going to start with, which one of the difficult things with history is always choosing where to start. I'm sure if I wanted to, I could have gone back to like ancient Roman history and talked about psychology there, but that's probably too far back for the scope of this class. So what we'll start with is a field of psychology called structuralism. And so this would have started in, you know, kind of early 1800s, basically. And the main sort of pioneers of structuralism were these two researchers, Wundt and Titchener. Titchener was actually a student of Wundt, so they worked together to come up with their ideas and theories. And the basic principle of structuralism, so first of all, what they focused on completely were internal thoughts and representations. So they were really interested in trying to figure out, you know, sort of what are the building blocks that make up the mind, was kind of the question they were trying to answer. So around this time, a lot of like chemists were making, you know, really good headway and trying to understand kind of the basic building blocks of our material world. You know, things like, you know, the periodic table of elements, they were figuring all of that out. And so Wundt and Titchener wanted to kind of take a similar approach to figuring out the building blocks of thought. And the method that they used to do this was something called introspection. And introspection was basically this method where they would, either themselves or their participants, they would have them just describe essentially their inner thoughts or their inner world. They would do this by having the person focus on some kind of object. So they might like look at a pencil, for example, and just talk about kind of what their experience of that pencil was. From this, Wundt and Titchener concluded that there were three basic elements of our internal world. The first they called sensations. So sensations are basically all of the sort of environmental stimuli that are making their way into your mind. So right now you can see this PowerPoint, you can hear my voice. You know, you might be sitting in a chair and you can feel kind of the, you know, the chair beneath you. So those would all be sensations. The second building block were images, and images are basically like ideas. They're kind of your internal monologue. So, you know, you might be thinking about, you know, what you're going to be doing later or whatever. You can also hold, you know, more like imagery in your mind. So if I told you to think about a purple dolphin or something like that, then you could stop and kind of envision that in your mind's eye. So those they called images. And then the third building block they called affections, which are basically emotions. Like, what are you feeling at any particular time emotionally? So structuralism was kind of the dominant force in psychology for a while until functionalism. You know, there were these researchers who basically came along and sort of protested against structuralism and founded the next subfield called functionalism. So functionalism, there are quite a few psychologists that were dominant in this field. One of the main ones was a man named William James, who is often credited as being kind of like the father of psychology, or the founder of more modern psychology. And functionalists mostly were inspired by Darwin and his theories of evolution. And so instead of worrying about internal thoughts, they wanted to focus more on like the biology of the human and how that influences our behaviors. So they kind of swung to that other extreme of focusing much more on observable behaviors. So like I said, William James was really prominent. Mary Calkins I put her under functionalism, but she actually kind of tried to reconcile both structuralism and functionalism. So I said there's this pendulum swing, but there's often people throughout history who try to recognize that both the internal thoughts and the observable behaviors are important, and so we should try to come up with theories that take both of those into account. Mary Calkins was one of those people. Just a side note, Mary Calkins was one of the first people who completed all the requirements to get a PhD, or she was one of the first women to do so. So she did everything she needed to do at Harvard to get a PhD in psychology. She took all the right classes and all of that. But Harvard refused to give her a degree just because she was a woman. And that was in the early 1900s, I think like the 1920s is when that was going on. Kind of around the same time, we had the rise of psychoanalysis. And if you've heard anything about psychology, you probably have heard about psychoanalysis and Sigmund Freud. Freud is, one of the dominant figures that people talk about in the history of psychology. A lot of intro psych classes will spend quite a bit of time focusing on Freud and his theories. I personally am choosing not to give him so much attention. One of the reasons he's often focused on is because he's basically the founder of therapy. So he was kind of the first person to come up with this idea that, people have all these unconscious issues that they're dealing with from childhood or whatever. And that if you, as a therapist, can sit down and talk through some of those issues, then people might make improvements in, their different symptoms for various mental disorders. So that's why he tends to get a lot of focus and credit, is because he was one of the first people to start that. But a lot of his methods and ideas were not scientifically valid. They were, in some cases, maybe even unethical by today's standards. He also had a lot of his own kind of issues. He was a cocaine addict, all these other things. And so I personally think it's kind of time to move on and not give him so much focus. We'll talk about him briefly, but he won't be, as much of a dominant focus in my version of this class as you might have gotten in other instructors' versions. Another psychoanalyst I want to mention is Melanie Klein. So she basically took a lot of Freud's ideas and used them to work mostly with children. So Freud, his actual clinical work was mostly with, adult women, whereas Melanie Klein decided to take his ideas and focus more on treating children. Okay, so I would say psychoanalysis, again, focused mostly on internal thoughts. So Freud's mostly dealing with trying to work through, what are these things in your unconscious mind that are sort of manifesting themselves in negative ways in a person's life, and how can we treat them? Behaviorism then became the next kind of dominant force in psychology for quite a while. And behaviorism actually sprung right out of functionalism. So functionalism really led to the rise of behaviorism. And behaviorism was, again, focused much more on observable behaviors. Most of the people I have listed here, in fact, I think almost all of them, focused really their study on working with animals, which is kind of, interesting if you think about it. Psychology is supposed to be the study of human behavior, but they used animals, for doing all kinds of experimentation, and then they tried to generalize their findings to humans from, working with animals. You may have heard of Pavlov. So if you've ever heard about, his study with like the dogs that salivate at the sound of a bell, that was Pavlov. And Pavlov actually originally was not a psychologist. He wasn't interested in psychology. He worked with dogs because he was studying basically like properties of their saliva. But as he was doing that, he kind of had this realization, or he saw that if a dog was getting food every time the like noon town bell rang or whatever, Then eventually they would learn to salivate at the sound of that bell, even if there was no food present. And so he made that observation and kind of realized that there's this process of learning to associate different stimuli together. And from that, he came up with the rules of, or kind of the properties of what's called classical conditioning, which we'll talk about more later. Thorndike had very similar methods to Pavlov. He worked mostly with cats, and he kind of, expanded on the work that Pavlov had did. B.F. Skinner did very similar things. All these people I should mention, the main reason that they worked with animals is because animals are much easier to control and to do experiments on than humans. So, as a researcher, I can get away with taking a bunch of dogs or a bunch of cats and putting them in cages and regulating every aspect of their diet and controlling, when they have daylight, if I can turn the lights on and off at different times, I can control if they get to interact with other animals or if they're going to be isolated, right? So I can have a lot of control over their environment, so I can do really structured experiments. Obviously, we cannot do the same thing with humans, so that was the main reason that they sort of focused on using animals. Mary Jones was one of the few in this list that worked with humans. So she took some of the ideas from the other behaviorists, and she used that to help children extinguish some of their phobias. And so she used kind of these ideas from conditioning to basically teach children who might have a phobia of animals, for example, to overcome that fear. Margaret Washburn, I have an asterisk next to her, so she's listed under behaviorists, but she used some of the methods that behaviorists used, but she didn't necessarily have the same belief that a lot of them did. So most of the behaviorists really kind of strictly, adamantly thought that we should focus entirely on observable behavior, that any focus on internal thoughts is basically useless and stupid. Whereas Margaret Washburn, again, was one of the people that kind of tried to do both. She thought that doing scientific experiments and, focusing on observable behavior is important, but that we also need to take into account what is going on in the mind whenever, an animal exhibits a particular behavior. She was also the first woman to actually receive her PhD in psychology, so, they actually gave her a degree. So behaviorism was pretty prominent for quite a while, and then eventually there was kind of this shift to what's called humanism, and humanism again was kind of a direct reaction to behaviorism. So these behaviorists have been focusing mostly on animals. The humanists basically said, like, okay, let's shift the focus back to people, but let's also do it in a more positive way. So psychoanalysis and behaviorism were kind of going on around the same time. And humanists said, let's focus on humans, but let's not do it the way Freud does. Freud focuses on all these kind of like negative things like aggression and repressed sexuality, whereas the humanists were more like, okay, let's focus on positivity, basically. Maslow is a name you might have heard of. He came up with something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Again, something we'll talk about maybe in more detail later. Eleanor Criswell is a more contemporary humanist. She's actually still alive. I think probably the only person on this list of people that is still alive. And so she focused mostly on kind of, how the physical body relates to our mental health. And she uses techniques like meditation and yoga to help, people overcome various negativities in their life, essentially. So again, this has been a very brief history of kind of 1800s to 1950 or so. There are obviously a significantly larger number of people who have contributed to the history of psychology, but these are just some of the prominent ones that have been important throughout history. So around the 1960s, that kind of brings us to a more modern perspective of psychology. 1960s is when there was what was sometimes called the cognitive revolution. So the cognitive revolution basically came out of kind of a confluence of multiple things happening at the same time. So one of the things that happened at the time was the rise of computers. So people had been working on computers for a while before this, but 1960s was kind of the point in time where like computers were efficient enough and cheap enough and small enough that, you know, like universities and places could start getting their hands on them and doing research and things with them. And so you might be thinking, like, what do computers have to do with human psychology? And it turns out there's a lot that it has to do with it. One is that, you know, the way that computers have been developed has been kind of hand in hand with psychologists. So a lot of the way that computers work is kind of similar in some ways to how our own brains and minds work. So both computers and brains, their main job is to process information. So right now, there's tons of information that's bombarding your brain. Again, there's my voice talking about all this new information you've probably never heard about. There's visual stimuli that you're taking in. There's all this stuff that your brain is taking in and trying to process. So it takes that and it tries to make sense of it. It tries to build associations between things that are happening now, things that have happened in your past. It has to figure out what is important, what should I pay attention to, etc. And computers do a lot of the same thing. They take in information, they take in inputs from your keyboard or your mouse or your microphone or whatever, and then they have to somehow process that. And so, you know, there's again been kind of the synchrony between psychologists, computer scientists, neuroscientists, etc., trying to make computers work in some ways more like the human mind works. Computers also gave us a lot of metaphorical ways to talk about the brain and the mind. So, you know, prior to the 1960s especially, the brain was kind of this black box that nobody could see inside. You can't really open it up and see what's going on, especially in real time as someone is like alive doing something. But a computer, I can open up and take it apart and look at all its different pieces. I can see, you know, modern computers, they've got a video card and a main processing unit, and they've got RAM for memory, and they've got all these different parts that do different things, and I can see how they connect to each other. And, you know, if one of those pieces breaks, I can see what effect that has. And all of that basically gave us a language to talk about the mind and the brain. So you will hear, you know, in neuroscience, there are a lot of terms that come from computer science, because we've used that as kind of a metaphor to talk about the mind. So that made it a little bit easier then to start talking about the mind in a way that is more scientific. So prior to this, anyone who focused on those internal processes, they were doing it entirely from a philosophical perspective. But now we can start looking at internal processes and doing it from a scientific perspective instead. Around the same time, there were also advances in neuroscience. So the brain is no longer a black box. Now we can start peeking inside and seeing, you know, what the brain is made of and what it's doing in real time with, you know, participants who are alive and functioning. And so that helped, you know, researchers basically be able to focus on, to kind of do everything. Now we can look at the observable external behaviors, we can look at the internal processes, we can see how those relate to each other, and we can do it in a scientific way. Some of the main figures that started this cognitive revolution, one was a man named Ulrich Neisser, who wrote the very first textbook on cognitive psychology. Noam Chomsky is often credited with kind of, you know, bringing down behaviorism and also shifting to this cognitive revolution. He focused mostly on language and how children acquire and develop language, and basically demonstrated that, you know, there's no way the behaviorists could explain language learning with the theories and the ideas that they had come up with. Okay, so all of that kind of brings us up to So in contemporary psychology, we have a lot of different diverse subfields kind of within the field of psychology. And each of these subfields are very different from each other. They focus on different kind of research questions and ideas. They use all kinds of different methodologies. They have different, you know, motivations and goals. You know, one of the ones I have listed here, this is jumping ahead a little bit, is clinical psychology. That's probably what most of you think of when you think of psychology. That's the approach of, like, you know, we're going to focus on people who have, you know, either like mental disorders, things like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, or people who are maybe dealing with more like everyday issues, like, you know, maybe they're suffering from a bout of depression because they just went through a period of unemployment, or they lost someone important to them, or maybe someone's shifting careers, they're having some anxiety from that. So clinical psychologists mostly focus on treating either those mental disorders or those kind of like everyday common issues, using things like therapy and medication. So that's probably what most of you think of when you think of psychology, but there's all these different subfields. I have some listed here. This is by no means an exhaustive list. There are lots of other subfields. And one thing I want to point out is that each of these also have, kind of like subfields within them. So we could break it down and get even more granular if we wanted to. So for example, my background is in cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology mostly focuses on how the mind processes information. And within cognitive psychology, like I said, there's all these, different areas of focus. So when I was getting my PhD, I mostly focused on sensation and perception, and particularly on visual perception. So I tested different theories that tried to explain how we can recognize various objects. How can we recognize people's faces? What's kind of the step-by-step process that's allowing our mind to do that kind of task. So sensation and perception is one kind of area of focus within cognitive psychology, but there are others, things like memory or learning or attention or language. There's all these different areas of focus that someone could explore within that field. Biopsychology is more focused on, how the body translates to human behavior. So there's a lot of focus there on neuroscience. But biopsychologists could even focus on things like the immune system, for example, or things that you might kind of more associate with the medical field. Evolutionary psychology, another big sort of field within psychology, basically focuses on how human behavior evolved over the past 200,000 to 2 million years that we have been kind of Homo sapiens or humans. So it really focuses on this idea that when humans were evolving, we mostly lived in a very different environment from the one we live in now. Our modern environment, things like, cars and computers and cell phones and all of that is really only developed in the past couple hundred years at the most, which is not enough time for, evolution really to have affected us very much. So most of our evolved behaviors come from a time period much earlier than our sort of modern environment or society, and there's a lot of conflict between kind of what we evolved in that earlier time period sort of mismatching the current environment that we have now. Developmental psychology, as the name implies, focuses on how we develop, basically from conception to death. It's a very broad field because it actually kind of tries to cover a lot of other fields. So it covers cognitive psychology to some extent. It covers social psychology to some extent, and basically tries to explain how we develop, how does our visual system develop from conception to death, for example. Social psychology focuses mostly on how our interactions with other people influence our own thoughts and behavior, can kind of focus on how society as a whole affects us. Another subfield in psychology is called personality psychology. So this tries to examine all the different types of personalities that people can develop, really tries to figure out how to kind of parse different personalities and how that can affect our other behaviors. One of the newest subfields within psychology is called industrial organizational psychology, and it's one that I know kind of less about than some of the others. Basically, industrial organizational psychology kind of focuses on more work environments behaviors. It kind of reminds me a little bit of a human resources, department essentially. But more of a focus on psychology than what an HR department might have. I think an HR department focuses more on laws and regulations, whereas, industrial or IO psychology is what it's often called, focuses more on the person and their feelings within the work environment. We had a discussion come up in class that's kind of spawned from this idea of IO psychology that I'll try to kind of summarize because I think it was interesting. That really talked about how, all these different subfields have very different goals and motivations. And typically when we think of psychology, we think of it as being this kind of like touchy-feely, trying to help people, which is what a lot of these fields do focus on. But some of these subfields, that's not necessarily their motivation. So with IO psychology, for example, I don't want to say this for all IO psychologists, but for some of them, the focus is more on trying to get workers to be as efficient as possible, to kind of help the company, with their bottom line, to make more money, to have more efficient workers that have higher output. Which, can be good, but can also sometimes maybe be detrimental to the workers themselves. And so we had a little bit of discussion about, not just with IO psychology, but a lot of these fields, you can get people who have maybe motivations that are counter to what we typically think of psychology as being, as like this field that wants to help people be better. Another thing I brought up sort of in this context, and I don't really have a field here that fits this, maybe I should list one, but a lot of the people that I went to graduate school with, for example, who got the exact same degree that I did, a PhD in cognitive psychology, have ended up working for really large industries, places like Google or Apple or Facebook, and their work mostly focuses on trying to help develop those products. And the best of those people, they're trying to help develop those products in a way that will then help the consumer. Like how can we make an iPhone or an iPad that's going to encourage people to use it for good. But a lot of those people are more focused on how can I develop an iPhone or iPad that's basically going to be more addictive. How can I develop technologies that are going to make people use them more and buy them more. So not all subfields within psychology are necessarily, again, kind of what you think of as like this field that's geared towards helping people. Health psychology is one that focuses more on how, there's kind of this interaction between our physical health and our mental health. Some people within that field might also focus on how we make various health decisions. Like, what would make someone decide to smoke cigarettes when they know that it's going to potentially cause lung cancer or other issues down the road. Clinical psychology I already talked about. And then forensic psychology focuses kind of on psychology within a criminal justice system or within a legal setting. So, part of that might be focusing on like what motivates people to commit various crimes. Like, what's the psychology of someone who decides to steal or who decides to be violent, for example. But forensic psychology can also focus on other aspects within the criminal justice system. So, for example, like, are there ways that we could make parts of our justice system sort of function better based on what we know from these other subfields? So, for example, are there things in cognitive psychology about how our memory works that could better inform how we do things like an eyewitness testimony or how we have people do like lineup procedures and things like that. So really looking at the interaction between psychology and the criminal justice system. So again, that's just kind of a brief overview of some of the main subfields in psychology. I hope the main thing that you take away from this slide is just this idea that most of psychology is probably not what you think of when you think of psychology.